Hello and welcome to the 9th lecture video in the Sheridan College online degree breadth elective course, Introduction to Medieval History. In today's video, we will examine the late 12th and 13th century, a time period widely regarded as the pinnacle of medieval culture and civilization. Indeed, it is this era which epitomized much of the common images of the Middle Ages, about knights in shining armor, the code of chivalry, and noble tournaments. It was this period which would witness medieval architects reach new heights of achievement with the soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals and the beginnings of the first universities. It would see an explosion of new forms of literature written in medieval French called romances, which told tales of chivalric knights and damsels in distress. It would also see the first movement towards modernity with rising literacy and a growing independence of city-states, the beginnings of government bureaucracy, and even the first early steps towards parliamentary democracy with the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. However, the period also saw its fair share of darkness and violence. We'll see how the brutality of the Crusades turns inward as the enemy is increasingly seen as other Christians and also Jews. We'll see as rulers across Europe impose new restrictions on Jewish populations, including the wearing of badges and distinctive dress. We'll see the Byzantine Empire teeter on the edge of destruction as it is attacked by Western forces in the Fourth Crusade. We'll see the rise of the medieval Inquisition, the persecution of Christian heretics in the south of France, culminating with the Albigensian Crusade, which would see thousands of men, women, and children massacred in the name of the Church. Today, we see the highs, the lows, and the beginning of the end of the High Middle Ages. The learning objectives for this video are: Number 1, understand some of the changes associated with the High Middle Ages, including the rise of city-states, the increasing power of medieval guilds, the beginnings of universities, and the increasing complexity of government bureaucracies. Number 2, describe the development of Romance literature in the 12th century and its impact on the culture of the European aristocracy. Number 3, understand the historical importance of the Magna Carta, the Fourth Lateran Council, and the medieval Inquisition. By the late 12th century, the Christian and Islamic worlds were in the midst of massive changes after having spent nearly a century on and off at war with one another during the Crusades. However, despite the near-constant warfare, the 12th century was also a time of artistic development and innovation in the Islamic world. The production of books had always been an important feature of medieval Islamic culture, but during this period, we also see the development of elaborate, illuminated manuscripts. Islamic scribes and artists created beautiful pictures and diagrams for scientific treatises, and illustrations were added to works of literature. In our last video, we saw how the Islamic world of Syria, Egypt, and the Middle East rallied under the leadership of Saladin, who defeated the Christian forces in the Holy Land, taking Jerusalem back and reducing the Christian Crusader states to just a few port cities. However, the empire that Saladin built would not survive his death. The family dynasty he founded, the Ayyubids, found themselves overthrown by the military class in the mid-13th century. The Mamluks, as they were known, had been soldier slaves under Saladin. While they did the bulk of the fighting, they had little rights for themselves. However, after Saladin's death, the Mamluks revolted against his heirs and established their own sultanate, which would prove to be far more enduring than what Saladin had built. The Mamluk Sultanate would last for more than 200 years until the end of the Middle Ages, when they in turn were overthrown by the Ottomans. On the western side of the Islamic world, in the mid-12th century, the Almoravids were overthrown by the Almohads, a new Berber dynasty from North Africa. By the end of the 12th century, they controlled the entirety of the old empire of the Almoravids, including Al-Andalus on the Iberian Peninsula. However, the Christian crusading movement, which had brought war to the Holy Land in Syria, also propelled the leaders of the Christian kingdoms to the north of Al-Andalus to attempt to push the Muslims out of Europe, and the late 12th century saw near continuous war between them. In 1212 CE, under the leadership of Alfonso VIII of Castile, a coalition of Christian forces defeated the Almohads at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. It would push the Islamic territory to the far south, and for the first time, the Christians controlled the majority of the Iberian Peninsula. For the Muslim citizens of Al-Andalus, it became known as the Punishment. It would be the beginning of the end for Islamic Al-Andalus. Over the next 200 years, the Christians would claim more and more of the peninsula, which eventually would become Spain and Portugal. For the Byzantine Empire, the 12th and 13th century marked a period of further decline. The great remnant of the old Roman Empire was far removed from the glorious days of its past. Despite having sparked the movement, the Byzantine Empire gained little during the First and Second Crusade. The Western Crusaders, rather than giving territory they gained back to the empire, instead created kingdoms of their own in the Crusader states. The borders of the empire remain a tiny shadow of what once was. The resurgence of Islamic power under Zengi and Saladin had further marginalized the empire. However, greater humiliation was yet to come. In 1202 CE, Pope Innocent III called for the Fourth Crusade to once again try to recapture the city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. However, the Western crusading army got sidetracked on the way to Jerusalem. The leaders of the army made a deal with the Byzantine prince Alexios IV Angelos to help him overthrow his uncle, the current emperor, and restore his father Isaac II to the throne. In return, Alexios promised to pay the Crusaders large amounts of money in support of their crusade to Jerusalem. And so, in 1203, the crusading army attacked Constantinople and succeeded in removing Alexios' uncle from power. However, the following year, Alexios and his father were deposed, and Alexios was killed by his own people in a popular uprising. With their deal in tatters and no prospect of receiving any of the money Alexios had promised, the Crusader army leaders decided that instead of going to Jerusalem, they would simply turn around and conquer Constantinople. In February of 1204, the Crusaders sacked the city and plundered its enormous wealth. For nearly a century following, the Byzantine Empire was largely controlled by Western powers, with just a small fragment remaining. While eventually in 1261 the Byzantines would regain control of Constantinople, they would never fully recover from the defeat. In Europe, however, the High Middle Ages marked a remarkable period of expansion. The population reached its height during the late 12th and 13th centuries. Propelled by changing agricultural practices and a growing economy, more and more people were surviving into adulthood since the beginning of the High Middle Ages. European cities had become vibrant trading centers with a growing wealthy urban class, the merchants, or bourgeoisie. Cities like London and Venice had at least 100,000 people living in them by 1300, and Paris, the greatest city of them all, had a population of over 200,000 people by that time. In the early 13th century, trade and craft guilds had become formalized and powerful groups in most medieval cities. Guilds such as the Masons, Carpenters, and Clothmakers created statutes to determine working hours, the fixing of wages, standards for materials and work, and rules for membership. In most guilds, there was a formal hierarchy. At the bottom were apprentices, in which young men, and sometimes young women, as teenagers, would begin to learn the trade. They would live with a master and his family for several years. After a period of time, they would finish their apprenticeship and graduate to become journeymen, or in French, a bachelor. For women, this was usually as high as they might climb, and even this opportunity would only be available in certain trades. As a journeyman or a bachelor, you had earned your right to practice in the trade. For a select few, they might one day eventually become masters and take on apprentices of their own. The rise of guilds during the 12th century had an effect on the distribution of work between men and women in the Middle Ages. During the early Middle Ages, for example, women had tended to be the main producers of woolen cloth produced in small villages, or even the brewers of beer. However, the codification of guilds more and more pushed women out of these professions, a trend that would continue into the early modern world. As cities grew in importance and wealth, some cities were able to secure more and more independence for themselves and eventually become states of their own. Nowhere was this more true than in the cities of northern Italy such as Venice, Florence, and Milan. Caught between the powers of the German Empire to the north and the papacy to the south, the cities played each of these powers against one another to their advantage until the cities had become powers in their own right. The Italian city-states made their own laws, ran their own courts. Over time, they had militaries of their own. They signed their own treaties, made alliances, and sometimes declared war, often on each other. Some of the Italian city-states were even republics, which offered a semblance of democracy itself, where a large percentage of the male population participated in government and helped make decisions. Others were controlled by powerful merchant families. To fund their government and military, the city-states developed some of the first versions of property taxes and state loans. The city of Venice, in particular, became powerful enough to control a vast maritime empire using a navy of state ships to dictate prices abroad and control vast trade networks. While the cities of Northern Europe never attained the same independence and power as the Italian city-states, the trend towards urbanization and increased capitalism was happening all over Europe. It is in this context that a new type of urban-based religious movement emerged, the Mendicant orders. In 1205 CE, a young man named Francis of Assisi, who is the son of a wealthy merchant, was at a crossroads in his life. He had spent a year in prison after fighting in a war between two Italian city-states, and the experience had changed him. According to his biographer, he had a vision and decided to make a radical change in his life. He gave up his family wealth and joined the beggars on the streets of Rome. Francis began to preach the gospel of the Christian Bible and in time attracted many followers who became known as friars, from the Latin word for brother, frater. As Francis's little group grew in size and fame, they began to attract the attention of church authorities. Preaching to the public without a license could bring trouble, especially in the environment of the 13th century, which saw several heretical groups already causing the church problems. In 1209, however, Francis managed to get an audience with Pope Innocent III, who, against all odds, gave the group his approval. The Franciscans, as they became known, would become a common feature of medieval urban life. Franciscan friars slept in convents on the outskirts of the cities and every day would beg for their daily bread and preach the Christian Bible to the public. Halfway between a monk and a priest, the Franciscans were one of the first mendicant orders, a word which is derived from the Latin word to beg, mendicare. A similar order was founded in the south of France by a priest named Dominic de Guzman at almost the exact same time. The followers of Dominic, also called friars and known collectively as the Dominicans, took similar extreme vows of poverty. These religious orders represented a radical breakaway from the monastic traditions of the past, abandoning seclusion and instead walking in the world. The mendicant orders would prove to be extremely popular, and eventually their orders would include thousands of members across the continent. Within the towns and cities across Europe, medieval Masons were also reaching new heights with a new style of architecture which we call Gothic, epitomized by the medieval cathedral. Cathedrals were considered the seat of the bishop and the heart of the medieval diocese, the basic territorial division of medieval Christianity. However, cathedrals were often much more than that. They were the tallest building and the emblem of the city itself, the religious, social, and economic center of the city. They included a large clergy, sometimes a monastery and school. They were often the resting place for the bodies and relics of Christian saints, attracting pilgrims from far away. Cathedrals had been built in stone since the early Middle Ages, but beginning in the 12th century, a new style would transform them. The Gothic style included several major innovations and built upon centuries of knowledge from both the Christian and Islamic worlds. Gothic architecture eliminated the heavy walls that characterized older medieval churches, using flying buttresses to take the weight off the wall. This allowed builders to fill the walls with windows and the interior of the cathedrals with light. Other important characteristics of the style, such as the pointed arch and the ribbed, vaulted ceilings, were first invented in the Islamic world, appearing for the first time in mosques in Al-Andalus. Together, the combination of all of these techniques allowed medieval architects to build higher than ever before. The medieval Gothic cathedrals took centuries to build, involving generations of workers. They were financed from a variety of sources, including the income from the bishop, taxes, and were sometimes supported by wealthy merchant guilds. The greatest examples of Gothic architecture, such as the Notre Dame in Paris or Salisbury Cathedral in England, stand to this day. While the urban environments across the continent were expanding, in the courts of European kings, a new type of literature and court culture was transforming the aristocracy in the High Middle Ages. As we've seen in a previous video, the feudal structure of the aristocracy evolved around the development of the medieval knight and the oaths of vassalage, which bound medieval nobles to one another in alliance systems. The medieval knight on horseback had evolved to be a powerful instrument of war. However, during the 12th century, a new type of popular literature written in French was beginning to create new expectations of conduct for knights and new ideals for them to aspire to. The stories and poetry which made up this new genre was part of a growing court culture in the 12th century. Increasingly, surrounding powerful nobles such as dukes or kings was an entire retinue of relatives, vassals or knights, women and priests, all of whom together created a sort of court culture. Central to this new culture was entertainment. Across Europe, there were numerous troubadours, musicians, actors, and poets who made their living traveling to and from these many court audiences. The work they produced, which became immensely popular, was written not in Latin, as most things were in the Middle Ages, but in the language that people actually spoke, most commonly French. The poems and stories were memorized and were usually performed aloud to the audience because literacy, even amongst the nobility, was still not widespread in the 12th century. The stories they told were called romances, and they were called that not because they had romantic elements in them, which they certainly did, but rather because romance was the common name of the medieval French language, meaning the Romans language, as French had evolved from Latin. There were many different subgenres, including the chanson de geste, which told tales of bravery, often involving the knights of King Arthur, and the fabliaux, silly poems poking fun at nobles and priests, often with sexual undertones. The stories, poems, and songs, which are sometimes collectively referred to as courtly love, began to create new aristocratic codes of behavior. This new system of expectations was chivalry, a word derived from the French word for horse, cheval. Chivalry added a type of morality to the warrior knight, who was now expected to live with high ideals, including fair play, loyalty, mercy, and honor. A knight within the culture of courtly love became more than simply a warrior. One of the greatest expressions of the development of this new culture surrounding knights was the medieval tournament, a public competition often held in celebration for some major event such as the marriage of a king or the signing of a peace alliance. A tournament included mock fights, jousting, games, all in celebration of knightly culture. Outside of the royal courts, the church, or rather the clergy, were also at the center of a revolution in education and literacy. As we saw in an earlier video, during the early Middle Ages, literacy was mostly restricted to the clergy. However, even within that group, the levels of literacy could vary wildly. It was not that uncommon for a low-level parish priest to only be marginally literate. During the 11th and 12th centuries, however, there was an increasing emphasis on the education of Christian clergy in Western Europe, and this resulted in an explosion of new schools and curriculum. Small schools since at least the Carolingian period in the early Middle Ages have been attached to monasteries and cathedrals, where an aspiring monk or priest could attain at least a basic education. In the 11th and 12th century, young priests, canons, or monks who needed to be educated increasingly flocked to cathedral schools in the major cities of Europe, particularly Paris and Bologna. There, students were exposed to a range of texts, such as the writings of great Christian church fathers, and by the High Middle Ages, also many classical philosophers such as Aristotle or Galen. The classics of Greek and Rome became more and more accessible in Europe by this time, having been translated and copied, often due to contact with the Islamic world, where many of these texts had been preserved. In the cathedral schools of the major cities of Europe, young men aspiring to careers in the church studied what became known as the 7 liberal arts. In the early years, they learned the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Eventually, they moved on to what were considered the more advanced subjects, called the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. After studying the liberal arts, some students would go on to specialize, depending on which city they were in. Paris became known for its advanced schools which taught theology, and Bologna became known as the place to study law. Students who finished these advanced programs could go on to serve popes, bishops, kings, and emperors as part of a growing army of literate bureaucrats. By the early 13th century, the number of students flocking to the cities of Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and other places was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. There were few rules which would dictate who could teach, who could become a student, and almost no common standards. The schools in these cities turned to an existing model to regulate their systems: the medieval guild. Just as guilds such as the masons, carpenters, or brewers could control standards, create rules of behavior, and decide when one advances from apprenticeship to becoming a bachelor or journeyman, so too could schools. The word university comes from the medieval Latin word for guild, universitas. So the first universities, which appeared in the early 13th century, were essentially modeled on the same system which worked for trade and craft guilds. University students were essentially apprentices, and they were taught by masters. After a period of study and examinations, they could advance to become bachelors, and eventually even masters, a system which is today preserved in the bachelor and master's degrees. It's in this context of increasing literacy and education that the role of kings and governments also began to change. As we've seen in our previous videos, during the early Middle Ages, kings were usually weak. They depended on the support of powerful noble families and had little to no ability to enforce laws or to exert control across their lands. The feudal pyramid that is often taught in school was a myth. Real power tended to be local, in the hands of powerful noble warlords who crafted their own laws, ran their own courts, and had their own military. A web of alliances in which the king was only one point of many is a better way of understanding the distribution of feudal power in the early Middle Ages. However, during the 11th century, things began to change as kings slowly became more powerful. Nowhere is this clearer than in England. In a previous video, we saw how in 1066 CE, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, invaded Anglo-Saxon England and defeated the English at the Battle of Hastings. William then became the new King of England. But in defeating the old Anglo-Saxon military class, He also had the unique opportunity to impose his rule more effectively than ever before. William replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility with a new one made up of his own knights and followers who were loyal only to him, and to whom they owed everything. He divided up the land, county by county, manor by manor, and gave it to them. They in turn owed William their allegiance. Those that crossed William would feel his wrath. A century later, a different English king, Henry II, would expand royal power in England even further. Under his leadership, Henry would lay the foundations for a powerful central government run by an efficient bureaucracy, which would become a model for rulers across Europe. Henry's birthright placed him in an enviable position. In addition to being King of England, Henry II was also Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy, and controlled many of the counties of northern France. Through marriage, he became Duke of Aquitaine too. While technically these possessions on the continent made him a vassal of the King of France, it was just that, a technicality. His possessions and military might made Henry powerful. In addition to his continental possessions, the princes of Wales swore fealty to him, the rulers of Ireland submitted to him as well, and Scotland was his vassal. All in all, Henry controlled territory from the Pyrenees Mountains in northern Spain to the moors of Scotland. However, despite this vast domain, Henry was still not as powerful as kings would later be in the early modern period. In fact, Henry spent much of his reign trying to keep all of these territories and suppressing revolts. Nevertheless, he was still able to create a greater centralized power base than most medieval kings could aspire to. As English kings continued to claim more power and centralization, there was an inevitable pushback by the noble barons of the kingdom. Indeed, it would be Henry II's son, John, who would face the limits of imposing power within a feudal system. Born either 1166 or 1167, as the youngest son of Henry II's 5 sons, few would have expected him to ever become king. However, fate had other plans. His oldest brother William died as a child. Next oldest brother, his father's heir apparent, Henry the Younger, predeceased his father by 6 years after leading an unsuccessful revolt against him. That left his brother Richard, who was next in line and who did become king when his father died. King Richard I of England, sometimes called Richard the Lionheart, would rule England for 10 years, but he spent much of that time away on crusade. He died after being shot by a crossbow, allegedly by a young boy during a skirmish in France. And at the time, he did not have an heir. Since his next oldest brother, Geoffrey, had died 3 years earlier after being trampled to death in a jousting tournament, this left just John, one of the most unlikely kings in English history. By most accounts, John was not a good king. He was constantly at war, but he wasn't very good at that either. He lost lands in Aquitaine, Anjou, and Normandy. Also, his constant wars were very expensive. To pay for them, he imposed heavy taxes. He could be brutal to those who opposed him. He was known to imprison and starve his opponents and seize their property. Eventually, the nobles of England had had enough. In 1215 CE, they revolted in what became known as the Barons' War. By May of that year, the barons had seized London, and in June, the king was forced to come to terms with the rebels. They met on a meadow near Runnymede, just south of London, where John was forced to agree to a charter which detailed the rights and liberties of the nobles. It was called the Magna Carta, meaning Great Charter. While most of the clauses in the document he signed dealt with medieval rights and customs, certain provisions would have a profound impact on the course of history. The central premise of the Magna Carta was that the king was not above the law. It guaranteed that all free men were entitled to justice and a free trial. It guaranteed that no free man could be arrested or imprisoned except by the judgment of their peers and the law of the land. Now, in many ways, the Magna Carta was also not that revolutionary. In the context of the day, free men essentially meant only the noble classes, not peasants who were bound by serfdom. The Magna Carta was also not completely unique. Similar provisions had been agreed to in older charters at different times. However, the Magna Carta did mark an important first step towards a constitutional monarchy in England. It would be reissued and revised many times over the years, but the core elements would remain. It is echoed today in modern constitutional documents such as the American Declaration of Independence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The year 1215, the same year that the Magna Carta was signed, the Western Christian Church under the Pope came to a turning point as well. The dawn of the 13th century would see the role of the Church expand into everyday people's lives like never before. Pope Innocent III had studied both theology and law in the new schools of the 12th century. Like other popes since Gregory VII, Innocent believed in papal supremacy and that it was his duty to strive for the moral reformation of all Christians. It was for this purpose that Innocent called the Fourth Lateran Council in the fall of 1215. Now, formal church councils were considered solemn affairs, and they happened relatively rarely. When a council was called, bishops from across Christendom were summoned to Rome to participate, to draft new church laws, and to decide doctrine. The Fourth Lateran Council was presided over by Innocent himself. The comprehensive set of canons that the council produced would alter Christian life in profound ways and mark a major expansion of the church into the affairs of regular people. Some of the most important changes that came out of the council were the further development of the Christian sacraments. The sacraments were holy ceremonial rites that all Christians would experience at different points in their lives. For example, all Christians would receive the sacrament of baptism when they were born, a sacrament that had long been established under church doctrine. The Fourth Lateran Council, however, now required that all Christians receive the sacrament of communion at least once per year. Communion was the ceremonial eating of bread, called the Eucharist, in a recreation of the Last Supper of Jesus before he died. The bread and wine were considered to be transformed into the actual body and blood of Jesus through a process called transubstantiation. In addition, all Christians were required to confess their sins to a priest through the sacrament of penance. More importantly, however, for the first time, marriage was also considered a sacrament of the Christian Church, one which was to be administered by a priest. For centuries, marriage in European culture had been a purely secular affair, an agreement between families to ensure divisions and inheritance of property. Of course, there were many cultural aspects of marriage, different types of ceremonies, and various laws created over the years which differed from place to place. However, the one thing that marriage was not, at least until the High Middle Ages, was a religious ceremony. However, over the centuries, the Church began slowly to have more involvement in the marriage ceremony. Long before the Lateran Council, the Church had already created strict rules forbidding divorce. But now, at the dawn of the 13th century, marriage would now be a religious rite, a holy rite of passage administered and managed by the Church alone. The Fourth Lateran Council also concerned itself with those that it considered the other, that is, people who were not Christian. It would be particularly harsh for the Jews. Small communities of Jewish people lived throughout Western Europe and had done so for centuries, usually in insular communities based in urban centers. Anti-Semitism, however, was common and widespread. As we saw in our previous video, thousands of Western Jews were murdered during the Crusades. They also faced major restrictions on their lives in most places in Europe, what jobs they were allowed to do, where they could live. Now, the Fourth Lateran Council imposed further burdens. The council required moving forward that all Jews must be identifiable by some outward sign of clothing. The rule would be interpreted in various ways across Europe. In some locations, rulers would sell Jews exemptions from the rule as a way to make money. In southern France and Spain, Jews were forced to wear round badges. In Vienna, they were required to wear pointed hats. In the later Middle Ages, things would get worse for the Jews as they increasingly faced persecution from the authorities. By the early modern period, most kingdoms in Western Europe had expelled them altogether. Some of the strongest language of the Fourth Lateran Council, however, was reserved for a different type of other: heretics. The word heretic comes from the Greek word for choice, heresis. So a heretic is someone who has made a choice. Heretics were considered different than those who were born under a different religion, such as a Jew or a Muslim. A heretic was someone who was Christian, but who had strayed away from the official accepted version and adopted beliefs which were condemned by the Church. Now, there had been heretical movements since the beginning of Christianity, but the High Middle Ages saw an explosion in their popularity. One of the largest and most important of the heretical movements were the Cathars. The Cathars were a dualistic Christian sect which flourished in the south of France during the 12th and 13th centuries. They were also sometimes called the Albigensians, as one of their major centers was in the town of Albi in southern France. While considering themselves Christians, the Cathars rejected the authority of the official church, which they believed was evil. In the Cathar faith, men and women were considered equal. In fact, women could even become Cathar priests, which were called perfects. By the late 12th century, Catharism had become so successful in southern Europe that many of the nobles themselves had become heretics. To combat heresy, the medieval church took several approaches. They empowered local bishops to seek out and persecute Cathars in their dioceses. They partnered with feudal authorities such as dukes, kings, and other leaders who created laws and meted out punishments to those who were found to be heretics. However, in the case of the Cathars, nothing seemed to work. In the early 13th century, Catharism had established itself so firmly in southern France that the church could not rely on local clergy to stamp it out. In 1209, Pope Innocent III decided to take an unprecedented step. He declared a crusade against the Cathars. For the first time, an official crusade sanctioned by the Pope was not launched to claim land in Palestine or protect Christians abroad, but instead against heretical Christians at home. By the middle of 1209, approximately 10,000 crusaders gathered in the French city of Lyon before marching south. The violence and brutality of what became known as the Albigensian Crusade is legendary. Tens of thousands of Cathar men, women, and children would die, sometimes horribly. Perhaps as many as 20,000 people were killed at the massacre of Béziers in July of 1209 alone. In the years that followed the crusade, the church also developed a set of judicial procedures known as the Inquisition, a traveling court which investigated and persecuted heresy wherever it was found. The new Dominican order of friars would ultimately play a central role in the institution, traveling into areas suspected of harboring heresy and conducting investigations and trials. Ultimately, the church would be successful in its campaign against the Cathars. By the beginning of the 14th century, what had been the fastest spreading heresy in Europe was virtually eliminated. The campaign against the Cathars in the High Middle Ages and its terrible outcome has been described by some historians as a genocide. So thorough was their success that Catharism would not survive the Middle Ages. As the 13th century came to an end and the High Middle Ages draws to a close, Europe, the Middle East, Anatolia, and North Africa began to change once again. So far in this course, we have surveyed over 800 years of medieval history. In our next lecture video, we'll move into the late Middle Ages and see how it all comes to an end. Next week, we'll see the rise of the Mongol Empire, one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, which stretched from China to Europe, creating a trading network unrivaled in the pre-modern world. And in the last videos of this course, we'll see the beginnings of the Renaissance, the introduction of the printing press, and new artistic achievements in painting and sculpture. We'll also see how the medieval world all comes crashing down during what is sometimes referred to as the long 14th century. We'll see how millions die in a great famine, only to be followed by the Black Death a generation later. We'll also see a war between England and France that will last a century, and the final end of the Byzantine Empire. All that to come on Introduction to Medieval History.